The development of the plane started in 1932 when Trans World Airlines approached the Douglas Company with specifications for an airliner that would outperform the excellent Boeing passenger plane, the Model 247. TWA had wanted to buy the Boeing, but Boeing's production was committed to United Airlines, TWA's arch rival. United was part owned by Boeing. Douglas accepted the TWA challenge, and a team set to work on the design. One of the first things they did was to study the 247 and identify the things they felt could be improved. They knew that both Pratt & Whitney and Wright Aeronautical were developing powerful new engines, and confident that one of these motors would be available, they settled on a twin-engine design, although TWA's order was for a tri-motor. Apart from the reliance on the new engines, they basically assembled the design from already developed ideas, like the Northrop aerofoil wing, retractable undercarriage, and wing flaps to extend the surface of the wings at landing, and produced a plane, the DC-1, which is immediately recognizable as a Dakota. In doing so, they far exceeded the original specification to match the Boeing, good though the 247 was. Their plane was faster, quieter, more economical to operate, immensely strong and robust, and carried more passengers. Only one DC-1 was built, and that plane crashed. But a slightly longer plane, the DC-2, went into production, and as soon as the first of them took to the air for TWA, on May the 15th, 1934, inquiries and orders started to pour in from airlines in the US and Europe. The new plane revolutionized the sophistication and comfort of airline travel, even allowing for the introduction of the first in-flight movies. The US Army was quick to notice the Dakota and took delivery of its first example in 1935. Obviously impressed, they almost immediately ordered 2 more. All 3, though ordered as prototypes for experimentation and testing, were soon turned over to service. 18 more, with the new specification of the large double cargo doors that distinguished the C-47, were soon on order, being used not only for transport, but as communications centers. Douglas also used the wing design and other common parts as a base to develop their B-18 bomber, to all intents a different plane, but sharing the economy and power of the DC designs. The B-18 saw limited service in World War II, primarily working as a coastal patrol aircraft. The commercial plane went from strength to strength, however, and soon development was underway on a new, further stretched, wider-bodied variant with space for comfortable bunks for the passengers, to be the Douglas sleeper transport, the DST. Fitted out as the airborne equivalent of a luxury liner, the DST took off for the first time on December the 17th, 1935. But the extra space of the new plane did not have to be devoted to bunks and sleeping compartments. It could be as easily configured without the extra windows for the upper bunks as a standard airliner. And in August 1936, the first of these planes was delivered to American Airlines, the first DC-3. With the war, production of the civilian planes stopped, and the C-47's mass production commenced. These planes saw service in every theatre of the war, in all conditions and in many roles. Their use in New Guinea was typical of their importance. On the ground, the Allies and their Japanese opponents confronted an environment where everything moved slowly, trapped in the mud of the jungle. It was only in the air that the wretched conditions could be overcome, and the C-47, as the biscuit bomber, became a major advantage that the Allies held. Allied troops could call on the Dakotas for airdrops. Airdrops backed by an efficient logistical train to meet demands for all the material needed in the front lines, from munitions to rations. By now, at the field, the C-47s were being hurriedly loaded. Then the biscuit bombers, escorted by fighters, would set off.
I'm the guy in that P-38. I'm upstairs looking out for trouble.
In those decisive months when the war in the Pacific finally turned against the Japanese, it was the C-47 and the parachute that combined to make the Allied victory in the jungles possible. Ground troops had other reasons to be thankful for the C-47's presence, for many a wounded soldier would come to owe his life to the robust Douglas airliner. Medivac units, using C-47s, evacuated wounded from combat zones to base hospitals, with nurses tending the injured in flight. The dedication, bravery and hard work of these young nurses should never be overlooked or forgotten. Just the knowledge that these air ambulances existed must have been a major boost for the fighting man's morale. Meanwhile, the Dakota was seeing service on both sides in the Pacific, as the Japanese had started building the airliner before the war and continued to build them with gun turrets as military aircraft throughout the conflict. Many more, probably over 2,000, were built in Russia, and together with a further 700 supplied under Lend-Lease, the Soviets used them extensively to move both cargo and troops. Here, carrying a Soviet parachute unit equipped for action in the winter snow, a Dakota goes into action. A far cry from the steamy jungles of the Pacific, but essentially doing the same job, helping to win the war. Germany's successful development of elite parachute troops, who had demonstrated their worth in the rout of the Allies on Crete, had prompted all the combatants to form such units. After D-Day, the cost of the use of gliders could be assessed, and it proved much higher than had been anticipated. It had been envisaged that there would be losses of gliders and their cargoes of troops and equipment, but the scale of the losses was staggering. Theoretically, even the gliders themselves were reusable. They were to be collected and recycled for repeated use. Instead, they were more a disposable item, as many of them were well beyond salvaging. More critical was the losses among the pilots, who, sitting at the front of the gliders, suffered disproportionately high casualties. These pilots were trained to almost the same level as their powered aircraft counterparts, and in addition, they had to be capable of operating, after landing, as fighting soldiers. They were an expensive investment and hard to replace. The third charter of costs was in the gliders' inability to deliver an effective fighting force to the ground, ready for immediate battle. Instead, there were unacceptably high casualties, and a large proportion of those soldiers who did arrive intact were dazed and confused, shocked by the violence of their crash landings. In addition, they were confronted by lack of equipment, lost with gliders that had crashed or landed elsewhere. Had the Germans been on hand in force as the gliders landed, the results may have been catastrophic. The gliders were used because they were available and because the reality of their failings was not foreseen. The courage and training of the troops they carried did bring limited success to their operations, but after a similar experience with use of gliders at Arnhem, they were abandoned, and in future other, more reliable means would be devised. Like the DC-3, the DC-4 continued in service for many years. Often overlooked, dwarfed by the reputation of its smaller cousin, the Skymaster, with its larger size and 4 engines, could fly across the Atlantic and had a very successful career. After World War II, the Dakotas could have expected a quieter life, but within a few years they moved on to another conflict, Korea. For a while in Korea, the Dakotas provided the same variety of services that they had during the World War, but other models were coming that divided the many roles of the C-47 into specialist areas. Here, Douglas's massive Globemaster is seen catering for armour carrying that its smaller brother could never have attempted. The role of parachute carrier was catered for by new, specially designed and equipped planes, like this Fairchild Packet. Its twin-boom tail permitted a rear exit, purpose-designed for dropping parachutes, whether they supported supplies or troops. The development of the specialist planes continued, and the need for tactical air transport was never higher than during the war in Vietnam. But despite its age and theoretical redundancy, even in Vietnam it was possibly only the C-130 Hercules that filled as many roles as the C-47. The Hercules was, of course, a completely different generation of aircraft, with jet engines powering its propellers. But its virtues of versatility and hardiness were those that had made the Dakota legendary. The plane was, in some ways, designed as a powered glider. If necessary, it could be considered a disposable item. Its wings were designed to shear off if they hit something, rather than slew the plane round as the older gliders had done so disastrously at Normandy. Fortunately, the providers rarely had to resort to making tactical crash landings. As this procession of specialist aircraft developed, it could be seen that by Vietnam, time may have run out for the C-47. Eventually, ironically, its prime advantage was to be its versatility. It seemed that there would always be work for them as long as they could fly. In Indochina, one of the uses of the Dakotas was in electronic warfare. Here, highly trained technicians board a specially equipped C-47, which is probably older than any of them. The purpose of these special missions was to establish the coordinates of enemy radio from several different positions. Flying low and slow, the C-47 was an excellent platform to pinpoint exactly where enemy targets were. The information would then be transmitted to American bombers, so that the steamy jungle of Southeast Asia was no longer able to provide an impenetrable cover for enemy troop movement. This type of operation was generally considered to be quite successful. Before every strike, senior American officers would liaise with South Vietnamese officials to advise them of the intention of the mission and to compare the latest intelligence. Flying into the night, the Dakota's crew would be advised of the final go-ahead as they navigated towards the target zone. The difficulties these men encountered and the risks they took were considered to be worthwhile. The Gatling gun Dakota was one of the few ways that such intense firepower could be moved into an area that may have erupted as a trouble spot over a matter of a few hours. Back in 1953, the United States Air Force awarded its highest non-combatant civilian decoration, the Exceptional Service Award, to Donald W. Douglas.